Hey everybody, it's Londa. Today we're going to do part 2 of our 2 painting color palette series where we do 2 paintings, 1 palette with the same exact colors. So in another painting, I painted this scene right here. Today we're doing the one that's on the right. We're using the exact same colors. We're using cadmium orange, permanent rose, ultramarine blue, and Payne's gray. I am using the bow hung watercolor paper. This is a 10x7. I've already traced my outline for the border and also taped it down. And if you want to see me do that, you can check out the video where I paint this and see my process. But I've already prepped it so we can jump right into it. We're going to start by painting the sky of this landscape. And if you notice, there are pops of blue in each one of these little areas in the sky. So we're mainly using blue, but we're also using a little bit of pre-mixed purple, a little bit of pink, and a little bit of our orange. Now, just like any sky that you make, you always want some sort of kind of barrier color between your blue and your orange / yellow. So for us, that's going to be pink. So anywhere where you see a pop of orange, you need to make sure that you add your permanent rose before you add that orange so that it doesn't kind of muddy, it doesn't turn brown, or it doesn't turn kind of a greenish color. So that's what we're going to do. So before you do anything, you're going to prep your paper. You're going to mark out that horizon line. So you can see here, I've marked it on my paper, my reference image. I've also marked it on my tape right here. And then you want to start by wetting the top part of your sky. So I have already done that. I just wet that paper because I want to make sure that I have those nice soft edges. So it's really important with your sky that your paper is wet. So now that I have using the wet into wet technique for my sky, I'm going to grab a little bit of my ultramarine blue and I'm going to just drop that in those 3 areas that I mentioned. Kind of like that. That's looking good. And I'm going to mix up a little purple with my ultramarine blue and my permanent rose. And I'm going to start to drop that in kind of around where I have my blue shapes. Because I'm going to start to create that barrier. Now, if it spreads too fast, you can just blot your paint or kind of push it back. But I don't really mind. After you add a little bit of purple, then you're going to move on to more permanent rose. And I'm going to just drop that in right against it. And especially in some of these darker purple areas that are just straight purple, you can do that. You can just drop it in directly into those spots. So I'm just dropping a little bit, especially I'm adding more of that permanent rose anywhere where I see orange. So especially in 1, 2, 3, 4 spots, I'm making sure that I have that pink barrier because otherwise I'm going to get weird greens or browns, and I definitely don't want that in my sky. And I'm just kind of blotting this around. It's going to make it look more sky-like. And I'm going to just blot out a few clouds here. That kind of spread quickly. So I'm just going to blot that out just a tiny bit. Do a couple more. Let's add a little bit more pink down below. Nice. And before, there's a ton of white areas, but I'm not going to worry about that because I want to be able to control the spread of my paint. So before it spreads too far, I'm going to plop in some of that orange. So I'm using cadmium orange. And if it's too orange right away for you, add a touch of that permanent rose, and that's going to warm it up a little bit and not be so stinking orange. And I'm going to drop it in just on the edge of where that permanent rose is. Let's plop in a little bit down here. And I'm not dragging it out yet because what I'm going to do is I'm going to use my orange, just regular cadmium orange, and I'm going to kind of water it down a little bit and use it like I would a yellow. So some of these super bright areas it's actually really saturated orange that's just watered down. And see how that looks almost yellow? That's just watered down orange. And when it's up against those other colors, it looks very bright. So that's how I achieved that with the same color. I'm gonna keep kind of wiggling some of this out, and I'm gonna try to avoid, see what happened? I did touch a little bit of the blue right there. That's okay if you get a little bit, but try to avoid directly touching that blue. So this is why I left some of those areas white, so I could drop in a little bit of orange to create that soft kind of glowy sky. And let's see, I feel like we need just a touch more of that permanent rose before we let this dry. So I'm gonna do a little bit more around here. And as this dries, it's the perfect opportunity to make these little clouds that are a tiny bit darker. So all that is ultramarine blue with a little bit of your permanent rose. There we go. And that'll be your nice cloud. If it's too purple, you can dull it down with a teeny tiny amount of your orange, and then it starts to get kind of dull, okay? Ooh, this brush is so big, it just mops up everything. There. And I'm gonna just drop those in here and there. And I'm gonna keep adding detail as this dries. See how you can start to see some of the edges of these brush strokes? That's because the paper is drying. So those edges are going to get crisper as it slowly dries. And that's the best for the sky, because some edges are crisp, some edges are soft. So when you kind of babysit your wet into wet paper, then you get the best outcomes. If you can be patient, that's the hardest part. Okay. I'm just kind of playing now. That looks good. And it doesn't have to look exactly like the reference image. I actually like it pretty light. Here's the first one I did. So you can kind of see the difference. I added a little bit of a soft pink here at the bottom, so feel free to do that. So after you have that kind of thin orange, you can go in with a tiny bit of your permanent rose and kind of fan that up, but just a little bit. I'm gonna let this dry before we move on to our first layer, which is our mountain. So wash out your big brush. We're gonna move on to using a size 6 brush. So we'll be back in just a second. Now that our sky is done, we're gonna use a little bit of ultramarine blue and Payne's gray to paint this mountain that's far away. So we definitely need the blue to kind of give it some distance. Anything that you want to make look like it's pushed back, always add a little bit of blue. So I'm using ultramarine blue and some of my Payne's gray. I'm just gonna show you the color there. That looks pretty good. It has a touch of purple in it. So if you wanted to add a little bit of that, that pink, you can definitely do that. And so I'm just using my number 6 brush. I'm rolling it in that paint. Let's make a tiny bit more. I just want it to be a hair more concentrated since I used it up. And now it doesn't start all the way at the edge. It starts at about 1/2 inch, kind of 3/4 of an inch in. So I'm gonna make my little line where I'm gonna start, and then I'm just gonna wiggle my brush and kind of go up and down. And I'm painting, the bottom of this is totally dry. So the top of my sky is not 100% dry. So, oh, and you can see there, it's still a little wet on this side. So if you start to paint your mountain in the background and it has a crinkly top to it, just give it a second and let it dry. Sometimes I'm impatient and I'll just go for it. And these little tiny crinkles just make it look like it's even further back. So if you want that crisp edge, wait for the whole entire thing to dry. Now that we're done with this, we're gonna let that dry, and then we're gonna move on to this grassy area and also the road. To create the grassy field, we're gonna mix almost all of the colors to create that tan color. And a couple of tips, anything that is further away should have a little bit more blue in it. Anything that is closer to you, so this front will feel warmer and probably have a little bit more orange or pink. So I have already started mixing this up, but I just want to show you too. So always start when you're mixing your colors, start with the warmest, or I mean the lightest color, which is orange. Then what we're going to do is take a little bit of that permanent rose and a tiny bit of blue, and you have this brown color. And if it's too, it's too purpley or too brown, you can add a little bit more blue to it. That dulls it down. And then if you really want to darken it and dull it down at the same time, add some Payne's Gray, and then you get this, very brown. But if you need it to be more tan, like we kind of want it to start out tan so that we can control how light or dark it is, then add more orange. I'm painting directly. If you want, you can make a few marks on your paper where that road starts and stops. And also, if you wanted to make, you want to draw that out, you don't want it to be smack dab in the middle of your paper. So a little bit further to the right of center is where you want that road to start. It's just kind of a rule of thumb when you are creating a composition. You don't want anything to be perfectly centered in your piece because it's just not as pleasing to the eye. Okay, so once I have my light lines, I'm going to paint directly with that tan color that I've created. If it's too dark, I'll just add water after I start painting. So see, that's a little dark. I'll just paint directly with water and drag that out. And I don't want this to dry immediately, so I'm going to keep adding water to maintain that consistency. You could also, if you're working in a larger space, like a larger sheet of paper, you could just start by using the wet into wet technique and then drop in your color. I'm just using up what's left in my brush, and I'm going to go back for a little bit more and darken it up. So I'll just drop it in while the surface is damp. I'm going to put some in next to the road because you can see that gets darker. You can draw some lines in as it dries. This is the same thing with the sky. So you can see while this was drying, I dropped in a little bit more to create a little bit more definition. So this is looking pretty good. This area is darker and duller. So I'm going to grab a little bit of, oops, that's black. I'm going to grab a little bit of my Payne's Gray and keep kind of playing around with that until I see the color that I like, that darker value. That looks good. And I'm going to darken up the edge next to the road. And there's definitely some little hills over here. So as that dries, I'm going to drop in more. That's it for our grassy field. We're going to let that dry before we add any other details like this. But one thing that you can do, if you want, you can babysit. Like I said, you can babysit your paper and wait for it to get kind of still moist. It'll accept the water without cauliflowering, but it'll have a harder edge. You can do that for some of these shadows right here, or wait for it to dry. So I'm going to come back and I'm going to do the glazing method so you can try that out and so you can actually see what it looks like as I'm doing it on the paper. Now that this is dry, what I'm going to do is for some of these shadow areas in the field, I'm going to go in with the exact same color, and I'm going to add some paint just like that. And then with a clean, damp brush, I'm going to kind of wiggle that edge so it looks soft. Okay, so that's essentially what I'm doing. But my brush was just a tad bit too wet when I did it right there. So practice this method a few times before you do it on the paper. So, because if you add too much water, then you're going to get the cauliflower effect. So I'm going to grab my paint. I'm just dabbing it into the color that I've already created. And that was that orange and pink and a little bit of Payne's Gray and blue. And I'm going to just create this little line right here. You could just leave it. If you don't want to do the glazing technique, you could leave it. So I'm going to dab my brush off That's why I like to have these little water Swedish dishcloths, because they'll help keep the moisture in your brush. But then you can dab off some of that paint. So you go dab, drag, and kind of fan that out. So it keeps it looking soft, but then you still can maintain that, that kind of gradient. So I'm just gonna grab a little bit more, and the surface is just a tiny bit wet, so I'm just gonna barely drop that in there, and it creates this nice soft look. I'm still gonna drag it out though, because otherwise it'll create that cauliflower effect. And I'm gonna do the same thing for any other shadow that I see. So I could darken it up back here and kind of drag it out. So added it, dried my brush, kind of dragging that out. If you have too much color in your paintbrush, then just wash it out and then do the dragging out method. There's a little hill right here I'm trying to create, a little ripple, and maybe a little bit, something right there. And anytime you see something like grass, you want to get the values in first, really softly, then you build up the detail. So if you've already done the first painting that we did, or that's part of this 2 paintings, 1 palette series, it's the same exact thing that we did before. So create these soft values first, then you build up the detail. So it's kind of a rule of thumb. Now we're just adding a little bit more detail here and there. You can start to add a tiny bit of the grassy detail on the edge, but keep it really light because we want to be able to control that. That's looking good. Now we're going to let that dry and we're going to work on our road. So the colors that we're mixing for our road is mostly Payne's gray with a little bit of your orange. Let me move my tray so you can see that. Little bit of orange and your pink, so that permanent rose. So at first you're like, what? That is turning really, really brown. But the idea is that you remember everything that's closer to you has a little bit more warmth in it. So you want to have the front of it a little bit warmer. Let me just show you this color here. That's pretty dang close to the front. And then when we push it back, we can add more of that Payne's gray to make it cooler and darker to help it recede into space. But we always want our front to have more warmth to it. And also by adding a little bit of orange and that permanent rose, it's going to unify our picture with, by using the same colors almost all throughout every level. So I'm going to take that kind of warm brown that I just created, get my brush a little wet because it's very concentrated, and I'm going to paint directly right on the road. And I'm starting in the front because that's where I said it was supposed to be the warmest. I'm overlapping the edge of my road. I'm going to dip my brush in, get some water. It's lighter right here, so I'm just lightening that up. And then I'm going to drag it back and paint that entire road. You can leave a few of these little white spots. I think that looks kind of cool and a little ragged. Now I'm grabbing a little bit more Payne's gray, pulling it into the brown that I just created for the road, and I'm going to darken up that road way in the back and a little bit on the edges here. And drag it out. And that's going to push that way back. I'm doing a couple of little vertical lines with my brush too, not too many on the edge to make it look like the bottom of the grass, just to give it some, a bit more dimension. And definitely do some right here. Remember, not too many. I'm gonna add a little bit on the edge here. I'm gonna keep it pretty basic. It looks like there's some trees way in the back. If you wanted to, you could take this dark color and just kind of use the tip of your brush to make it look like there's a few trees way, way out in the distance, but you don't have to do that because sometimes when you have something so dark like that, it starts to make it not look too realistic. Now what you can do, you can add that center line in the road. I'm gonna go back with my original brown that I mixed up for the road, and I'm just gonna paint directly and kind of drag it. If it gets fuzzy, like way back here, that's actually a good thing. And something like that. That looks good. I'm gonna soften those edges up using my glazing technique because that paper is pretty much dry. I'm gonna soften those edges and kind of make a few lines because it looks like this road is really, a lot of people turn in this direction or turn out. That's not too bad. Okay, we're almost done here. Now we're just gonna pop in this fence. So what you can do, make sure that this is completely dry, that grassy field. And then if you want to add a little bit more detail with the grass, you can, but honestly, this is such a small space. I would keep it pretty basic and light. And then I'm gonna use my Payne's Gray to make that a little bit of Payne's Gray into the brown that I already have, because remember, that's gonna unify everything. And I'm just making it a touch darker. You don't want this to be black because look at how faint that is. Just like our road, it gets a little bit fuzzier as it recedes and a little bit less concentrated. Now, I'm going to paint just a few of these lines right here and then do a bunch of little tiny vertical lines as it goes back, kind of parallel to the road. So I'm going to start with this. I'm starting with my big ones first because everything will be relative to the thing next to it, right? So if I start out this big, then I know that my other lines will need to get smaller in comparison. It looks kind of funny at first. I'm going to get rid of some of that so it looks lighter. Let's get rid of more. Just barely. I'm just going to blot that so you can really hardly see it. And then this is where you don't really want any paint. You could use a nice flat brush, or you can just kind of really kind of pull your round brush to a point. And I'm just going to plop in a few little lines for the fence. You know, I think making it even lighter is better because then it shows the distance. And I'm going to use up some of that black, not black, but a dark brown, Payne's Gray, randomly. There we go. Basically done. If you wanted to add some birds in the sky, you want to add some more grasses, you could definitely do that. Here's how my other one turned out, just so you can kind of see the difference of my roads. I hope you had a ton of fun with this. If you haven't done so already, definitely go back and do our other painting from the 2 Paintings, 1 Palette series. These both have the exact same color, so they look really pretty next to one another, and it would make a great gift. It's just really good practice. It's fun. So I will see you next time. And of course, the thing that I always forget, but the thing that I think people want to see is the tape. Let's do the tape peel, okay? Look at this. Perfect. Lovely. All done. All right, see you later. Bye-bye.